Okay, I guess we're good to start. So in the last session, we covered all kinds of discovery techniques, different ways to profile hosts, and basically find more information about your target. This session is the fun part, which means we're actually going to own a bunch of stuff and talk about once you own stuff, where you can go from there and what you can do with it. So to start off with, so in most pen tests, you start off from the external side. You don't have access to the internal network. Your scope is limited to the IP addresses and the information that are visible from the internet. So this is often called, the crunchy candy shell, just because it's a hard layer. You can't really get much information out of it. Once you do, it cracks and you're in. So at this point, the only thing you can really touch are exposed hosts and services, VPN services that may be offered, and client-initiated sessions. And that's one thing that most people actually don't think about when you're doing a pen test is at any given point on a corporate network, there's actually a lot of outbound connections coming from the inside server back out. And depending on what type of client it is, what protocol it uses, there's things you can do to actually influence those sessions and send data back in. A good example of that is any UDP-based service, for the most part, goes from inside, going through a NAT gateway back out again, will actually create a mapping of UDP service on the external side back into that client source port. We'll talk a little bit more about an example application of that, but keep in mind that those types of established connections can be influenced, can be poked at from external attackers. So first off, this is basically old hat stuff, but it's something to keep in mind. Has anyone here actually used the FXP protocol, like way back in before 2000? Awesome, great, all right. So FXP was awesome, because what FXP does is you took one FTP server and you kicked another FTP server, and using the port and passive commands, you made them transfer data directly to each other. So instead of you actually having to download the files from one server on your little 28K dial-up, and going to another server, uploading your 500 meg movie file to that server, since you're a Where's courier when you're doing this. Thanks, guys. So all the Where's couriers use this because they can transfer files from two fast sites directly, and the way that worked is FTP has a control channel and a data channel. The data channel is defined by either the port command or the passive command. That basically just says, this port's opened up, connect here and send your data. So over the last few years, most of the FTP servers out there have restricted it so FXP won't work. They do that by checking the source address and making sure the source address of the connection to the data port matches the source address of the control channel. And a few of them don't still, and those are lots of fun, but we'll talk about the case of the opposite of that, where during active FTP, which is where the client actually opens up the source port and the server connects back to that source port, not a single client I know of actually checked to make sure the source address connecting back into its data port is the same as the server it's talking to. So keep that in mind. If you're attacking an FTP client behind a firewall that has support for active FTP, which is kind of a stretch in some cases, if you can find that data port externally, connect to it and send data, the client won't know the difference. You can replace the files they're downloading with your own. So how to find those depends on the firewall in use, but basically you can just keep sweeping certain port ranges trying to find open ports. And you can even force an active FTP connection in some cases by forcing people to go browse for an FTP URL, things like that, via the browser. So you can combine a client-side attack that forces them to do an FTP outbound connection with this technique to basically bust back in to get their FTP source port. So you can basically send them to an FTP URL of a trusted site and then replace the data they think they're downloading from that site because you're already trying to connect to the port the second it opens up. So that's one side of it. Another sort of well-known technique is if you have a NAT gateway that looks for people doing active transfers, it'll look for the port command being sent across and NAT ports on the firewall. And there's tons of different techniques you can use to basically force the client to echo data back out that makes it look like it's setting up a connection and basically just pop a hole straight through the firewall to whatever internal host you want. So that's a fun trick too, but it's already been covered to death. I'm not going to go over it. So finally, passive FTP transfers. If you can find a host and that host allows anonymous access and the data ports that it allocates for transferring data is sequential, then you can basically brute force the ports above that and hijack the data ports before another client can get to it. And as we mentioned a minute ago, most FTP servers prevent you from actually replacing the data. In other words, when you connect to that port that you guessed, they just disconnect you. Well, so what? You still broke the client's transfer. They still can't do their backups. So a good indication of, let's say you're polling the server via IP ID from that previous slide with a graph on it, and you say, okay, they're doing FTP transfers. And you realize, hey, they're doing an FTP backup to this other server. If that server allows anonymous access and you can sample the port command results, you can actually use that to basically break their transfers, prevent their backup from happening. So these aren't meant to be kind of like earth-shattering attacks, just things to think about when you're doing a pen test, is how these protocols work, how you can influence it. And even in the case where you can't directly control the data channel, you can still prevent them from doing something that may be a business-critical operation. And the exploit for that is called passive ag, for passive aggression, because it breaks the passive command, basically. And you can still find that online. Just Google for it, or it's on metasploit.com, users, HDM, tools. So a little bit. Web servers are still lots of fun. I'm not going to go through all the different web application attacks out there because people beat the stuff to death. But definitely brute force your vhost, definitely brute force your files and directories. You find the best stuff this way. For about 3 years, Cray.com had a directory called /old on their web server. And whatever you did to GET request, it gave you an index listing. And in that index listing was a file called backup.tar that's 5 gigs wide, long. And if you download that file, it included all of Cray.com's web server. It was awesome. So, and they did it every night. So you can see the mod time has changed. It's like, wow, if I ever want to be disaster recovery for Cray, I am now that person. They finally actually changed the directory permissions, so that's the reason it's mentioned here is they finally fixed it. They don't let you see the directory listing anymore, and they changed the file from backup to something else. So if you can find the actual real file name again, you can probably keep doing it, but I couldn't find it offhand. Another thing you should look for, especially doing pen tests, is whether people leave source control files in the web root. A lot of folks will do SVN checkout and just take that data and stick it directly in the web root, especially if they have an internal source repo where they keep their web applications, like good developers, they keep it all in a repository. What a lot of people forget to do, though, is delete those. Instead of doing SVN checkout, they should be doing SVN export, which will actually, or CVS export. That'll remove those CVS directories, .svn directories. The example on here is, kind of stupid, just some random guy's website that I happened to find this morning that had this issue. But a couple pretty high-profile sites had this issue for the last few years, and they finally fixed it. A good example is freshmeat.net. So freshmeat.net, which is a lot of people's favorite sites for open source applications, you just went to /CVS/root. You get the CVS root for where Scoop stores all its files. So it's actually an SSH URL to some random host. So if you ever want to attack that organization, you can find out where their development tree is stored that way. Another example of that was eBay. So for a while, eBay.com actually had CVS entries available for most of their web hosts. It was pretty damn funny. So they finally fixed that about a year ago, but it was lots of fun to go through their images directories and find all the stuff they had in there, and it's fun to poke around. So 2 other quick hacks, and then we're going to get into some stuff that Valsmith is going to talk about. If anyone's using Apache as a reverse proxy, and you want to figure out whether they are doing that, the easiest way to do that is just put a %00 in your GET request. That'll actually break Apache's request parser, and the Apache reverse proxy between you and the real server will spit out an error in a version number in a lot of cases if it's got the tag set. So this is an example of basically being able to find out if a reverse proxy is in place. And if it's in place, now you know you can do those cool IPS evasion techniques, like doing like OXOB, OXOC instead of spaces between your method and your URI. Because what will happen is the Apache reverse proxy will strip those off, think it's white space, and then resend the request with those being real white space back to the vulnerable IIS server or whatnot. So that's a way to bypass use Apache-style evasion techniques against a non-Apache server after you footprint it through this first technique. Is anyone here familiar with Apache Dynamic Virtual Hosting? All right, well, it's kind of obscure, but I see a lot of really large web hosts doing it. How this works is instead of defining a different virtual host for every single host in your Apache configuration file, all you do is say Apache Dynamic Virtual Hosting, use this directory as the base. Here's the options to apply to all these users, done. And what that does is whenever host name comes in, Apache will look at that host name, map it to a local file system in the directory, try to find a subdirectory matching that virtual host name, and if it exists, it'll serve it up as a virtual host. So it saves you a whole lot of time as an admin because you don't have to go through and do all this work. The downside, though, is if the web server is configured in the global configuration file to have plus indexes on, so index, directory listings indexes, and they have dynamic virtual hosting, there's a neat bug where if you set the host name to be %00/, it actually triggers a bug where Apache will give you the entire directory listing of all the virtual hosts, because it serves up the directory below the virtual host directory. It serves you up all of those. So this is a quick hack. If you're attacking an ISP and you want to figure out which virtual host they have, this is one easy way to leak that. And this is the first place it's ever been presented, so hopefully they won't fix it for a while.
Yeah, %00 is magic. It just breaks all kinds of stuff. Okay, so we're going to talk just a little bit about load balancing. You can use, in some cases, load balancing to cause networks to leak information that they hadn't intended to give you. For example, internal IP addresses. One way to do this is to use a TCP half-close request. There's a product out there called the Alteon ACE Director, which is a web load balancing system. And it's a good example of this problem. So this particular product mishandles the TCP half-open or half-close requests. There's 2 things you can do with this behavior. One, you can use it as a signature to say, okay, well, these guys are running this particular load balancing software. The other thing that you can do with this is get the load balancer to tell you the IP addresses of the internal network because they get forwarded back to the client. So, look for load balancing systems. Do your best to fingerprint them. This is sort of an obscure type attack, but it can give you some good information on the network.
Kind of a lesser known attack, but something you may see is any case where you've got a web application with a long-lived session going through a load balancer. A lot of times, if you just keep your session open long enough, the load balancer will screw up under high load and give you someone else's session. An example of that is if you run ASP.NET, and this is actually a bug with ASP.NET 1.1, and hopefully it's been fixed by now, but keep an eye out for it if it hasn't. If you have what's called sliding sessions enabled in ASP.NET, and you have basically, that says anytime your session cookie expires, automatically renew it. I had a client that, they're actually a bank, they went through and their customers, after 20 minutes of being logged in, would all of a sudden be staring at someone else's bank account information. It gave them the wrong session. So a bug in the lookup table is actually giving someone else's ASP session when the session expired. So when you're doing tests against a web application, like you may be in a hurry and really want to get a test, you really want to just bust a shell on it, but go ahead and write something in the background to do it while you're doing your other work that basically just keeps the request open for 20 minutes, keeps doing a request with it, and see if anything changes. Because there's a lot of bugs, just the longevity bugs, where things actually change over time. So keep an eye out for those because I know they're not much fun because you have to sit there and wait for it, but at the same time, they can actually leak some really cool details.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more about attacking web systems. One thing that's common on sites that host a large number of virtual hosts or other types of web directories is that they tend to have lots of CGI issues, especially if they let their customers write their own CGI scripts. And this isn't necessarily anything new, but this sort of shows you the mindset that leads you to a whole bunch of machines compromised. So in this particular one, we were going after a system that had thousands of hosts. Some were actual, target.com, some were thecompany.com / whatever. Inside all these different virtual hosts were CGI directories with a bunch of scripts, some user-written, some downloaded, some commercially purchased. In this particular case, they had one script that we found a directory traversal bug. This didn't really get us much, right? It didn't get us a shell, but it let us poke around the web server. After a while, we determined that all the CGI directories were executable and writable by the web server, which is good news for us. And it's actually pretty common on web hosts. So using this directory traversal bug, it turns out that we can enumerate things like usernames, directories on the server, backup files, sort of like what HD was talking about earlier, and all kinds of information that helps us get closer to getting a shell on the system. It turns out that this particular target happened to be running Solaris. The nice thing about Solaris is that it treats directories as files when under certain conditions. For example, if you cat a directory name, it'll come back as if you had done an ls in that directory name. So using this directory traversal, you can sort of map out the directory structure of every directory that the web server user account has access to. This is great because it shows you, let's say you don't know all the virtual hosts, you should know there's a bunch. The directory structure may be something like HTTP / website / vhost1, vhost2, vhost3. And you can really map out what all the different hosts to attack are. So using this directory traversal, we were able to find script names to a whole bunch of CGIs, stuff out there like if you ever heard of web hints or various CGI scripts that are vulnerable. So this is, I don't want to call it vulnerability scanning, but in a way it is. It's traversing directories to look for vulnerabilities that you can use. And on this large web host that had thousands of websites on it, we were able to find a couple hundred different ways of getting in.